Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Megan, and we have a fantastic topic to talk about today. We have Patrick Cahill, our president of Twice as Nice Recruiting. Patrick, how are you doing today?
Doing great. Excited to chat.
Awesome. And of course, we have the lovely Carolee Coleman, our VP of Search at Twice as Nice Recruiting. Carolee, how are you?
Doing awesome. I'm excited to be here.
Yes. Well, we're excited that you're here too. And like I said, we have a really great topic to talk about because we're talking about how to interview for employers. I feel like there's a lot of resources out there for candidates when they're interviewing, but maybe not so much for employers when they're interviewing. And it can feel like there's a lot riding on just a few questions, right? You have to evaluate a candidate. You have to learn about them. You have to sell your opportunity to them. And that can seem like a lot to cover within a short hour or even less. So let's not waste any more time and let's get into how to interview for employers. But first, let's get to know each other. We are Twice as Nice Recruiting, and we do one thing, that's permanent placement. We build every single search from scratch. We have a 9.9% placement fee, and we guarantee your placements for 18 months. We've worked with more than 1,800 clients to fill roles across the board, and today we're redefining recruitment. All right, so like I mentioned, there's a lot of information for candidates out there when it comes to how to interview, but maybe not so much for employers. Carolee and Patrick, what's a big mistake, maybe the biggest mistake you might see employers making when interviewing candidates?
I think the biggest mistake is really just not having a plan. And so the plan could include how many interviews need to happen, who's involved in the interviews, or even what interviewers want to learn during the process or what that timeline looks like. So going into it without some sort of idea of what's going to happen can just be really problematic.
Patrick, is it kind of like if you're going on a road trip and you don't have a map, you don't really know where you're going to end up? I mean, do you have too many pit stops along the way and, it gets too convoluted? How important and why is it important to have this plan?
I think it's like going on a road trip and not knowing when you're going to get to your destination and not know what you're going to do when you actually get there. And it's kind of a waste of a road trip if you don't have that plan. And so I think oftentimes employers are operating on, we'll figure it out as we go, almost assuming the search is going to move slowly. But sometimes you find that amazing candidate or that candidate finds you really early in the process and you don't want to be figuring it out during the actual interaction with the candidate you really want to have join your team.
Not having a plan detrimental to the employer or the candidate more, or is it equally detrimental? I don't know. Carolee, perhaps, can you take that question?
I think it can really hurt the employer, but it also impacts the candidate's perception of the whole experience. So in terms of what might happen when you don't have a plan is you might end up confusing the candidate, leaving them feeling like they're not your preferred candidate or like they're never going to get to the finish line. And so it can impact the experience the candidate's having. And then that in turn impacts the employer because they might lose candidates as a result or might never really make that forward progress that they're looking for.
We see lots of really great companies that do such great service or create such great products for their customers. And it's the infrequency in which they do hire for a specific role that can make them seem to the candidate like they're disorganized and they're a mess. And maybe in that moment they objectively are, but it gives the wrong impression of how the whole organization operates because it is an infrequent activity. And that makes it even more important to have that plan so you don't put the wrong foot forward to a candidate that can really contribute to an organization that they would learn is so rock solid when it's actually doing what it does every day.
How important is the candidate's experience within the interview? Is that a mistake that a lot of employers might make, is kind of like not considering that?
I definitely think so. So in addition to not having a plan, it's not really thinking of the candidate experience and keeping in mind that it's a two-way street. You're interviewing a candidate to figure out, are they a good fit for your company? Do they have the skills that they need to be successful? But they're also interviewing you just as much to try to figure out, will they be happy working for you? Will they be happy at your company? And so keeping in mind that their experience is very important is also key. And I think when it comes to not thinking about their experience, it's that two-way street. It's also being mindful that people have lives. And so, if they're employed, their current availability might be limited because they do currently have a job and they have a life outside of that job. Or even if they're not currently employed, they might have a lot of commitments. And so they might not have the ability to just, respond and say, yes, I can do an interview 2 hours from now. It might take some planning. And then just sometimes when we have unnecessary kind of in-person elements too quickly, it can impact the candidates because are they fully bought into the role and the company already? And you're asking them to get fully dressed and drive into your office if you're trying to do your first interview as in person. So sometimes keeping in mind that candidate experience and maybe doing a video or a phone call first, just to make sure that there is that initial chemistry, that there is a little bit of a fit before you're looking for a bigger commitment from people. And then if you're just peppering the candidate constantly with questions, but not taking the time to sell the opportunity or even sell yourself as their potential manager, I think that can impact the experience as well.
The nice thing too, the experience that Carly mentioned around requiring an in-person interview as the first thing, and how that's at times inconsiderate to the candidate, and unnecessary. It also goes to the original kind of big mistake of not having a plan, because not only could it actually be a better experience for the candidate to not have to come in dressed up for a screening interview where, more candidates might end up not being a fit than are a fit. You actually also can speed up your process of working through candidates through a properly planned out screening element to your whole hiring process, which can help you when the market's competitive.
So we've talked about kind of two mistakes that employers might be making. So I'm curious, what is the ideal interview process then? How does the candidate experience and this plan fit into the entire interview process well?
Good question. So, in creating that plan and thinking of the logistics, you want to think about what types of interviews will you have. So just like we just mentioned, maybe starting with a phone or video first as your screener before you move to in person. You want to think about the number of interviews you need, and timing. How close together will those interviews be happening? And can you lump some of them together so you're not having a bunch of separate interviews? Maybe you can chunk some of them together and have one person meet the first 30 minutes and have another person come the next 30 minutes. Is it a really busy season? So will that slow things down? Or are there vacations coming up that could really stall out your interview process? So thinking not only about who's involved, but what their schedules look like is really important. And then making sure before you start those interviews and the hiring process that you have a budget and that you have the authority to hire. Making sure everyone who needs to sign off on the position has already signed off can definitely be key.
This is all interlinked. So, Carolee mentioning figuring out who's going to be involved, planning the logistics there, making sure you have approval. It also ties into having agreement on what it is we're looking for, and making sure that everyone involved in the hiring process is actually aligned with what are we trying to discover about candidates? What are red flags? What are things that get us really excited? And then when you break down how the interviews are going to occur, splitting up the questions that allow you to evaluate that individual, in the entirety that is relevant for the role is critical, and also makes you as an organization seem so much more coordinated and put together to the candidate. So there's just a lot of value and I think benefit to having that coordination, both on a calendar standpoint, but also on just who are we trying to hire? What are we actually trying to contribute to the organization? And what's our best bet at figuring out who's going to do that?
I'm curious a little bit about the human connection. I think that seems kind of obvious, like, oh, yeah, you can make a connection with someone. But when you're trying to evaluate someone for their skills and, their professional background, that can probably pretty easily get lost in that evaluation. So, Patrick, I'm curious, how do you try to make that human connection? Like, as a president of a company, when you're interviewing for roles within your company or for clients, how do you kind of tailor your interview style to try to make a connection with your candidates?
I guess I try to be myself first off, and so because I think the best thing I can do is try to be true to the environment that they would actually work in, because I do believe that it's about a mutual fit. I've learned to stop telling people not to be nervous. I've learned that has no positive benefit because people are going to be nervous. But what I try to do is make sure they realize that I also, to a degree, am nervous in that I know it's a two-way street. So I do come out and say, I think this interview is mutual. I'm going to ask some questions, you're going to ask some questions, and we're going to try to get further down the line of understanding, is this a mutual fit? Are we both excited about this opportunity? And then I try to also, when I talk about next steps, and I try to share what my plan is, what the timeline is, so that way there's no mystery. I'm not trying to dangle some like, I wonder if they'll ever call me back type of question mark. I don't play around like that. But also, I like to emphasize, and we'll check to see if you're interested. So I try to follow through with just from start to end. This is a two-way street, and we may or may not be interested, but you also may or may not be interested, no matter how we feel about it. And that's kind of just how I try to build that human connection and really uncover whether this individual is going to, be a great fit, and we're going to be a great fit for them.
And I think one of the things you mentioned there is key to one of the things we've been talking about, which you said you tell them what the timeline looks like. And that's why having a plan and knowing what the steps are is so important, because if you know the plan, then you are able to tell them, hey, we're going to reach out about next steps and here's what they look like. And that can go really far with candidates.
So you have to make this human connection. You have to have a plan of like how the steps are going to go. But then you also have to evaluate candidates to ensure that they are a good fit for, one, the role, and two, your firm. So how can you, Carolee, evaluate candidates and like test their skills and make sure that they're the right fit without really giving them a test?
Mm-hmm.
How can you evaluate candidates?
I think the first step is really making sure that you have a clear job description that everyone on your team is on board with. And then you can build out the requirements on that job description. What's an absolute necessity versus what's a nice to have? And then based on that, you can build your interview around those requirements and those nice to have pluses, and keep those in mind to assess candidates so that you really know what you're going after. And then that way you can make sure that your interview is really tied to the specific job at hand and not just a general conversation. I also think it's important to try to avoid maybe some of the wacky questions where you're trying to trick people. Because again, thinking about the candidate experience, it might not leave them feeling the warm and fuzzies about your company if they feel constantly trying to trick them and stump them, especially when it's not related specifically to the job at hand. And then, just like Patrick mentioned, people are going to be nervous. You might be nervous interviewing this candidate. And so having some grace and compassion can really go a long way, and realizing that with time, the candidate may warm up a little bit more and might feel more comfortable. So it might take a little bit of time before you're really seeing their true colors.
I think we've talked a lot about it being a two-way street. Usually candidates that are in high demand, when they decide to kind of raise their head up and look for a new opportunity, they'll find themselves presented with more than one opportunity. And while salary is a huge part of the decision making, we see it time after time where candidates also are really thinking about, will I be happy in this organization? And there's a good margin of willingness to take lower pay if they just felt an emotional better connection with a group of people, because they recognize, yeah, that job might pay 10% more, but like, man, I didn't like those people, and most good candidates are hoping to be in an organization for years. And so, these are small steps, but can actually make the difference of getting across the finish line with a candidate you're really excited about.
All right, thank you both so much for redefining recruitment with us today. I think we got some great tips and insights for employers out there so that they can hire their next fantastic candidate.